You never know, you know? So it was let's get into these controversial waters with respect to Islam, because obviously
Oh, yes.
you and I have both spent a lot of time here, and we agree. I think we agree largely. I think there are probably some interesting points of disagreement, though, but we certainly agree that the reflexive denial that the unique problems we're seeing in the Muslim world have anything to do with religious doctrine, that denial that we see everywhere is a real cause for concern, and it's intellectually and ethically unjustifiable. And you and I both spend a lot of time convincing people that there really is a connection between the way people behave and what they believe, and they're telling us what they believe, and we should believe them
Right.
in most cases. So jihadism is not merely political. It's amazing that that's still a controversial point. I think we probably do have some different intuitions on certain points. So tell me a little bit. I think you and I once had dinner, and you were talking about how living in Montreal gave you a somewhat different picture on questions of immigration and whether Islam was amenable to reform in the way that someone like Majid Nawaz suggests. And give me
Sure,
your picture
sure.
of what's going on.
Incidentally, when you mentioned earlier a conversation that would have been difficult to have had it, to be had, I tried to have that conversation with Majid. I reached out to him because I disagreed with some of his prescriptions, and he blew me away because apparently the final inerrant word had been written in a book that you had done with him. So that would be a manifestation in my eyes of someone who wasn't willing to engage in a discussion. Notwithstanding the fact that I had started my clip by saying that I applaud his work and this is the type of guy that we should be supporting, but there were specific details that I disagree with him. But that said, so to go to your Montreal question, look, the reality is that, and you've said this a million times in very large forums, we have to differentiate between, of course, individuals and between the ideology. Just let's say it for the 1 millionth time. So individual Muslims might be lovely, but what happens to a society when it becomes more Islamized? That, if you'd like, is a question that we all have to ask.
Mm.
And there are really,
Actually, Gad, before you get into that, which is
sure.
exactly where I want you to go, you might just tell listeners who aren't aware of it that you have a background that gives
Oh,
you that
sure.
kind of a life experience here
Right,
that
sure.
many of us don't have.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. So I was born in Lebanon. I grew up in Lebanon, and so my mother tongue is Arabic. We're Arabic in a multiplicity of ways, and some of the music that we listen to, and the foods. And if you saw us, you wouldn't know that we are anything but Arabic. The only asterisk is that we're Lebanese Jews.
Mm.
And when the civil war broke out in Lebanon in the mid 70s, it became about as precarious as anything can be to be Jewish in Lebanon. And so we had to leave under imminent threat of execution. So some of the things that people in the West now are used to seeing in terms of ISIS and so on is stuff that I grew up with in Lebanon, right?
Mm.
That was my reality. That's what I escaped from. And so I have first hand experience. I mean, not that that means that whatever I say should be more trusted, but of course, I am shaped by my own unique experience. And my own unique experience says that at any point, something could be dormant and then it comes alive. And when it comes alive, look out, right? Because people will point to, oh, but didn't you have an otherwise peaceful existence in Lebanon before that point? Well, yes and no. I mean, we were tolerated, right? To be tolerated in the context of the Middle East is very different than to be equal, right? You're tolerated, it means that we're not going around decapitating you. Well, that to me is not the best benchmark of being an equal citizen under the law, right? So there were institutionalized laws that did not permit Jews to do certain things, even in the most progressive of Middle Eastern countries, Lebanon, right? My brother, who was the Lebanese judo champion, I think 3 years running, had to leave Lebanon before the civil war because there were threats on him that he could no longer compete in judo because it wasn't good for a Jew to constantly win the title.
Mm.
So these realities are things that we faced every day, even pre-war. So that's really the background that I come from. My parents were subsequently, after we emigrated to Canada, and you may or may not know this. I'm not sure if we had discussed it in our last get together, but my parents kept going back to Lebanon after we immigrated to Canada. And in 1980, they were kidnapped by Fatah,
Mm.
and some really nasty things happened, but luckily we were able to get them out. So, I have, in the same way that some of the other people who are in this space have personal history with this reality. I mean, I have it all, right? I mean, I've lived it, I've escaped it. For about 20 or 25 years after we escaped Lebanon, I used to have a recurring nightmare where, they're coming to kill us, and I have a gun that either malfunctions
Mm.
or I run out of ammunition. So this is real, right? This is part of my, if you'd like, my memory DNA. So that's my background, and it shapes what I'm now seeing in Montreal, which is that Montreal is becoming increasingly Islamized. So if we compare, the number of people that we would see in Islamic garb in Montreal, 12, 13, 14 years ago to today, I mean, it's just breathtaking. Now, does that mean that we've turned into Yemen? Of course not. But we can sort of guess what the trajectory is. With more Islam, is there more peace? Is there more tolerance? Is there more freedom of speech or less? I mean, it's a very simple calculus, right? In the same way that at the end of every day, we can determine whether that day I've put on weight, nothing has changed in my weight, or I've lost weight. We could ask the very same question. When Islam becomes a majority in a particular society, is it for the better? And by better, I mean by all the tenets that we hold dear in the West. Is it unchangeable, or does it get worse? And so that's what we really have to look at. Not so much whether how many terrorists we let in, if we let in immigrants. Is does Islam, once it becomes dominant, change the fabric of our societies? And regrettably, the answer is yes.
Yeah, yeah. So this is one of these topics that's very fraught, and I have a position here with respect to Muslim immigration in the current context of the election, because I've been struggling to figure out what someone like Hillary Clinton could say that would make sense given the realities we're talking about. That wouldn't be just the sanctimonious drivel that you hear from, unfortunately, from the current president and from really all Democrats, which is that this has nothing to do with Islam, and to even think about paying attention to somebody's religious background when you're deciding whether to admit them into the country, that is synonymous by definition with the worst forms of bigotry. So, as listeners to this podcast know, I'm not a fan of Donald Trump's, and yet if you catch him in the midst of a single sentence or something that purports to be a sentence, you will hear a more honest note struck here. It'll be something like, "Listen, this is coming from one religion. It's Islam, and we know this, and we can't lie about it. And therefore, the fact that someone has a Muslim background tells us something about the possibility of, one, that they're jihadist, and two, that they harbor opinions." Now I'm starting to speak in a way that Trump wouldn't, but that they may in fact harbor opinions that are deeply inimical to everything we value culturally: free speech and the rights of women and the rights of gays and all the rest. And so it is just a fact that if you're going to let in 100,000 Muslims from a country like Syria, even with the best of intentions and even with some process of screening, you will let in some percentage of that 100,000.
And you know what that percentage is, by the way, Sam? Do you want to take a guess what that number is?
Well, this all turns on how good your screening is, right? So if with no screening, then you're sampling the whole society. But one hopes that there's some process of vetting here that weeds out people who are obviously Salafists or obviously sympathetic with ISIS or all the rest. So Douglas Murray was talking about this
Mm.
on the podcast, some probably a year ago now, when the migrant crisis was really kicking off. No matter how good your screening is, you have to honestly acknowledge that no screening paradigm is perfect, and that there's so much political correctness on our side that one, has good cause to doubt whether any screening procedure would be of the sort that you and I would support, right? So, like, are they really going to ask intrusive questions about a person's religious convictions, and are such questions sufficient to tease out attitudes. I mean, let's say you could screen out all the jihadists by magically asking the right questions. Are you going to be committed to screening out people who really, down to the soles of their feet, despise freedom of speech, right? People who, it would take 10 years for them to figure out that they want to live in a society where cartoonists can draw the profit, right? Because right
Right.
now they think that those people should be hurled from rooftops. The numbers of people who believe that in the Muslim world is far in excess of anyone who would say they support ISIS or even jihadism. And so that's the situation you're left with. To let in great numbers of Muslims is different than letting in great numbers of Christians, even from the same societies, or Yazidis from Iraq, because of specific facts about the doctrine. And this is what is refreshing about the juggernaut of narcissism and delusion that is Donald Trump. Most people are in denial about this reality, and it's something we just have to honestly talk about. Now I say all this believing that the prescription of not letting in Muslims or not letting in anyone who could be Muslim from any of these societies is not workable and in fact not wise for the reason that many sanctimonious liberals espouse, but obviously they espouse it in the context of not actually acknowledging the nature of the problem. I mean, the buffer against Muslim extremism and the only prospect for reform in the Muslim world is Muslim moderation on some level. So it's got to be, at minimum, it's the ex-Muslims, right?
Right.
It's someone like, Sarah Hayter, right?
Right.
Who just who 10,000 Sarah Hayters given huge platforms. That's what the world needs. And if you keep Sarah Hayter out because she came from the wrong country, or you keep Faisal Saeed al-Mutar out because he came from Iraq and he was Muslim, those are the people who have to be empowered, and those are the people who have to be given all the resources we can muster, and those are the people who we need here. Then we need people who are just like them in their commitment to liberalism and pluralism and tolerance and rationality, but who, for whatever reason, are still identified as Muslims, like Majid Nawaz. You need people like that at the mosque in Montreal or New York or Houston or Los Angeles. And those are the people who are our early warning system against, and really our immune system against the spread of, quote, Islamic extremism. So if we just followed the Trumpian line of saying, okay, no more Muslims, I don't see how we have taken the step to empower the reformers.
So, look, I completely agree that somewhere between Trump's prescription of no more entry of Muslims and the open door policy of the ostrich brigade lies the sweet spot. The problem is, or it may be a problem or not, or we may or may not disagree, is where that point is. From my perspective, I struggle with this issue all the time because no one probably knows more nice and decent Muslim. Probably no one has more Muslim friends than I do by virtue of my background, right? So obviously, at the individual level, there is no discussion to be had. There are very nice Muslims, there are very bad Muslims. We're talking here about statistical regularities, right? Our brains have evolved to detect statistical regularities. I mean, that's a central feature of the architecture of the human mind.
Mm.
The reason why we don't go down a dark alley, I satirized an argument that Lawrence Krauss had made about how statistically it's insignificant, the likelihood of you dying from terrorism, so don't worry about it, by using the following analogy, right? I took the data from all murders for a particular year in Canada, which is very small. Your chances of dying of murder in Canada is unbelievably small. If you look at the number of murders in Canada that were committed in dark alley, which is a subset of that, it's astonishingly smaller. Yet most of us, when faced with the choice of walking, in a public street or in a dark alley, we refuse to walk down that dark alley. And so then, of course, I satirize it as we're being dark alley ophobic, right? The reality is that it's a numbers game, and the reality is if you let in 100,000 people from those countries, where many surveys show that the rate of genocidal anti-Semitism is 95%, 98%, 99%. So that's a really small minority of 99% of people, right? Now, if I, as a Jew, say, you know what, I'm not really comfortable with 95% of 100,000 new people coming in who I know hate me and my children. Is that a rational position for me to take? Now, if you keep those values at the door the minute that you come in, if there is a magic way by which we could decontaminate you from that hatred, then come in, my brother. I don't care if you're brown or white or blue or Muslim or not. But to the extent that we don't have that magic machine, then the numbers that we let in has to be such that it doesn't have any capacity to irrevocably change the character of our society, right? When you're letting in 1 million people to Germany,
Hmm.
it doesn't take much of a demographer by looking at the differences in fertility rates to say, look, I can predict that in 40 years, you guys are going to have trouble. Why? Well, because when Islam becomes in the majority, chances are you don't get John Lennon singing Imagine while holding hands with the Jews. We know that. We've got 1400 years of history of that. So we just have to be honest about it.